and welcome to Badger Talks Live, which brings exciting happenings, resources, and talent from your I am pleased to announce Professor Cherene Sherrard-Johnson, who is the Sally Mead Hands-Bascom Professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is the author of Portraits of the New Negro Woman, Visual and Literary Culture in the Harlem Renaissance, Dorothy West's Paradise, A Biography of Class and Color, and the editor of A Companion to the Harlem Renaissance. She is the author of 2 full-length poetry collections, Vixen and Grimoire, both from Autumn House Press, and Mistress Reclining, an award-winning chapbook. Her creative nonfiction and poetry have been published in The Rumpus, Plum, The New York Times Magazine, Verse Daily, The Journal, Terrain.org, Blackbird, Waterstone Review, Prairie Schooner, and numerous other journals. Please join me in welcoming Professor Cherene Sherrard-Johnson.
Thank you, Emerald, for that really nice introduction. It's wonderful to be able to share a screen with you today, however briefly. Nice to connect again. I want to thank everyone at Badger Talks for organizing this, especially Fran Julio and Anthony behind the scenes, and just everyone that worked together to make this happen. And also to you, the audience, for tuning in, possibly during your lunch hour, or if you're elsewhere in the world, could be any time. That's sort of the beauty of the Zoom. Especially excited to have you here today to talk about creativity in crisis, the practice of poetry. So what I wanted to do this afternoon is give you an overview of my work. I am a scholar, a professor, and a creative writer, and also a poet. And so this talk really begins with, I would say, my scholarship and ends more with my creative work. And so I'll take you on a tour through the long, long tradition of African-American poetry, stopping in to do some close-ups on the era that I know the best, which is the Harlem Renaissance, and giving you a little bit of a taste here and there of some other moments when poetry came together to galvanize the community, the nation, and the world. I wanted to begin with this beautiful image of Amanda Gorman. Now it's very familiar. This is the former Youth Poet Laureate who presented the inaugural poem at the inauguration of President Biden. And the community was transfixed by not just her words, but her performance. And I wanted to begin with her because I wanted people to have the sense that while she's certainly new on the scene, that she comes from a community and a long tradition of griots, of raconteurs, of spoken word poets, of print poets, that really goes back since the beginning of the experience of Africans in the Americas. So really 400 years that was behind her and with her as she was presenting. So I want to share, I'm not going to play the whole thing because I know many people have seen it, just going to share a couple of the first few minutes of this video.
Mr. President, Dr. Biden, Madam Vice President, Mr. Emhoff, Americans, and the world. When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We've braved the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always just is. And yet the dawn is hours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. We, the successors of a country and a time where a skinny black girl descended from slaves and raised by a single mother can dream of becoming president, only to find herself reciting for one. And yes, we are far from polished, far from pristine, but that doesn't mean we are striving to form a union that is perfect. We are striving to forge our union with purpose, to compose a country committed to all cultures, colors, characters, and conditions of man. And so we lift our gazes not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put our future.
So I wanted to begin with her words, which are very inspirational, and not just in terms of what she's saying, but also her delivery, which is very much out of the tradition of African American performance. It's a tradition that goes back to the church in terms of oratory. So there was quite a bit that was familiar to those of us who are familiar with seeing those gestures, that experience. So she really communicated on many different registers in the choice of words, the delivery. I wanted to begin or just immerse us in that experience and then take us back to the woman we believe or is known to be the first African American poet to publish a piece of poetry. And I'm going to go to a screen here. Her name is Lucy Terry. I will say that this is not an actual representation of her. It's an artist interpretation of what the artist thinks she might have looked like. Some of the images, the remainder of the images you'll see are going to be of the actual poets, but I just wanted to put that notice out there. So Lucy Terry wrote a poem called Bars Fight in 1746. And I won't always read the entirety of these poems, but I do like the words to be up there so you can see them. She wrote about an event, a skirmish, an interaction between the community of settlers, so colonial white settlers in Massachusetts, and the indigenous population there. Lucy Terry's role in that space was complicated, right? She was a Black woman, but really at that time still very much an African woman as well in transition, alternatively enslaved and free, a servant. And yet she found the desire to report. This is in some ways a poem or using poetry as reportage, right? The famous statement of getting the news from poems. I'll just read a little bit of this. It begins, the title is Bars Fight, and it begins with, August was the 25th, 1746. The Indians did in ambush lay, some very valiant men to slay. So she uses the language of her time. She uses a very familiar, consistent rhyme there in this piece. And again, it's really a story poem. It's a narrative that names the men and people who died in the skirmish because she wants to record their actions, that they were there, they were present. The content of this over time certainly is somewhat controversial. Again, she's reporting on the experience of her time and what it meant to be a woman seeing these events happening. It's just very much the beginning of Black people in this country using the language, using English, right? The colonial language, the language that they were forced to learn after being brought here and under slavery, to begin to speak back, to speak their own voice. And that's going to be a theme that I talk about with regards to this idea of creativity in crisis and also the practices that evolved out of it. What do we do with the languages that are not our own? How do we create new forms? What do we do with the traditional forms? How do we change them and use them in our own way? So many of you might not have been familiar with Lucy Terry. Some will be more familiar with this image, which is of Phillis Wheatley, that comes from her book. So Lucy Terry did publish that poem, but she never published a book of poetry. She's one of the first poets, but it's hard to think of her as in the same way that we would think of Phillis Wheatley, who was definitely a poetess or an author of African American poetry. She published the first known book, Poems of Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, in 1773. She wrote about her experience here. One of the poems that you might have read in high school or college by her would have been on being brought from Africa to America. Phyllis Wheatley was really one of the small number of people who was a survivor of the Middle Passage who wrote about it, right? So you're getting a firsthand account from her in terms of what it means to survive that experience, and then also write about it and share that work in a volume that was widely circulated as well. Moving up now, so we were in the 18th century. So just wanting to think about time here. Again, we begin with Amanda Gorman, and then we're going backwards. I want to spend a little bit of time with Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. In addition to poetry, Harper also wrote novels. She has a novel called Iola Leroy that is very well known. She was an activist, more so, I would say, than with the tradition of Terry and Wheatley very early in this country. By the time you had Frances Harper beginning to write poetry, the abolitionist movement is in full swing. And the poem, let's see if I can click to, I have to go to another place to get to the poem here. I'm going to exit out just very briefly. Now you're getting the full experience that you would get if you were in my class going to a different site. So this is a Poetry Foundation site, which is a wonderful location to access lots of different poetries. They have a wonderful collection here. So this poem by Frances Harper is entitled The Slave Mother. And I wanted to linger here for a bit to talk about some of the uses to which African-American writers have put poetry. That is the idea of, at a time of great trauma, under duress, under slavery, Frances Harper was a writer who used her verses to create empathy for especially enslaved women. So the title of this poem, The Slave Mother, really uses language that would appeal to a wide audience, an interracial abolitionist audience, to get people to understand the experience of what it means to be separated from your child. And she uses very traditional verse here in terms of the language, the rhyme scheme, and she's got these consistent stanzas. Stanza, it's just a section of poetry, 4 lines is what she's using here. And I'm going to read a little bit from the first stanza and the 4th stanza here. Heard you that shriek? It rose so wildly on the air, it seemed as if a burdened heart was breaking in despair. And then I'll skip to the 4th. She is a mother pale with fear, her boy clings to her side, and in her kirtle vainly tries his trembling form to hide. One of the things that Harper does, or a strategy that she uses, is descriptions pale with fear that would create, again, empathy with the majority white audience at this point that she would be hoping to reach out to develop sympathy for the anti-slavery cause. And part of what that directive was, it wasn't just to make people feel empathy, it was also to galvanize them. So there was this notion of, if you could change your feelings, or if your feelings could become right, you would actually act in the moral, you would act morally towards trying to end slavery. So there is this history, a long history of using poetry politically, right? And working on many different registers. So people might not know, obviously Harper's poem is entitled The Slave Mother, so that's, that definitely gives you a hint there. But again, using the rhyme scheme, the repetition, it may not be readily apparent that that is a poem that has such a strong political undercurrent. It's couched in sentimental, romantic language, and yet when you listen to the words, the effect of it is one that is galvanizing. So over the course of the long history that African Americans have been writing and living and fighting for their rights in this country, there have been certain time periods where various movements have come around, where you would have a group of collective of poets or writing communities really come together. It's always interesting to think about whether it's scholars like me who like to historicize and quadrant off certain periods because it makes them easier to teach. But it is true that there is often a cyclical feeling to when poetry is much more in the public arena, when people are reading it and very excited about the different ways that they're getting it. And so we can think of various times in which that's happened. Certainly around the time that Harper was writing in the mid 19th into the turn into the 20th century, she actually had a fairly long career. This was a period where, again, African Americans were using their voices to protest first slavery and then after slavery, the events of Reconstruction. And writing was a big part of that. And part of how that writing was disseminated was in poetry journals, magazines that people sometimes held a subscription for, and they could access it that way. So that the reading audience, I mentioned that Harper used language to appeal to an interracial audience. As we move forward into the end of the 19th, into the 20th century, the literacy rates among African Americans were growing. And so the audience that was available to digest and read poetry by Black authors, Black poetry for Black authors, was also growing during that time. Now, the period of time that's been the focus of my scholarly work, it's not the only area I focus on, but it's one of the major areas. I teach lots of classes on the era known as the Harlem Renaissance, which begins around 1917, really the end of World War I, and then goes right up until, we often call it the interwar period, goes up until around 1935. It stops before World War II. Really, the Depression puts a bit of a ceiling on it. So those are loose dates. People like to use 1917 to 1935 or interwar period to talk about the Harlem Renaissance era. But really, we often think of it as being longer because, as I've shown you, the history of African American poetry begins in the 18th century, really. So by the time we get to the 19-teens and the 1920s, we are already seeing innovations on what has come before. So you'll notice that the two images that I have here are from a magazine that was produced by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. This was their monthly, and it's called The Crisis. So there's a little play there from my title where I have creativity in crisis. Now, The Crisis was a magazine in which you would find lots of poetry from the era. In fact, many of the writers would have published in this. This is how it would have been disseminated. They also produced poetry in the kind of circles that we would see now. So they held poetry salons. A very famous one was called the Dark Tower, and it was held in one of the salons of Madam C.J. Walker, who was known for being like the first Black billionaire, millionaire, made a lot of money off of hair products. You might have seen, there have been some TV movies about her recently. She was a patron of the arts, and during the Harlem Renaissance provided space for writers to share and exchange work and get feedback. And so you really had this idea of a poetic community now coming around during this time. And again, these images of the crisis, which were often showcasing African Americans in the community who were successful, who were educated. There was this sense of wanting to revive or show the kinds of contributions that these newly freed, in some ways, peoples were engaging in. And it was also a place for, again, not only showcasing achievements, but also galvanizing news from around the world. So those poems would have appeared with articles reporting from all of the different parts of the globe, not just the United States. So two of the writers that I wanted to focus on from the Harlem Renaissance that may not be as familiar as writers like Zora Neale Hurston or Langston Hughes. Usually when we talk about the Harlem Renaissance, if I ask people, who do you know from that era, it would be Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston would have been the two who come to mind. And they're writers I teach a lot and I love their work. But I thought it would be nice here to focus on some writers that are less well known. So the first one, this is Helene Johnson. She was actually very young. She was a teenager when she came to Harlem with her cousin, Dorothy West, who's a novelist that I also have written about. You might have heard a reference to it in the introduction there, that I wrote a biography of her. So Dorothy West was the novelist, and her cousin, Helene Johnson, was the poet. Um, and so this was one of her more anthologized poems. And again, you might have read a poem like this in circulating in one of the journals during the time. I'm going to read actually this in its entirety. Sonnet to a Negro in Harlem. You are disdainful and magnificent, your perfect body and your pompous gait, your dark eyes flashing solemnly with hate. Small wonder that you are incompetent to imitate those whom you so despise, your shoulders towering high above the throng, your head thrown back in rich barbaric song. Palm trees and mangoes stretched before your eyes. Let others toil and sweat for labor's sake, and wring from grasping hands their meed of gold. Why urge ahead your supercilious feet? Scorn will efface each footprint that you make. I love your laughter, arrogant and bold. You are too splendid for this city street. So one of the things I wanted to highlight about this in terms of thinking about form is that she is using the form here of the sonnet, the Shakespearean sonnet or the English sonnet. And you might have studied this in school, and you would know, or those of you who might not, that a sonnet is usually composed of three quatrains, 3 4-line stanzas, and a concluding couplet. And the rhyme scheme there is A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. Okay, so going back to high school, if you had to go through and label lines of poetry, you might have remembered that. I know that's one of the reasons why sometimes people are like, oh, I'm not excited to read poetry because I remember having to scan and count syllables. The only reason I'm throwing that out there is I want you to just have a sense of that is what, that's what a traditional sonnet is. But really, people use that form very loosely. And so throughout this, I'm going to highlight some what I would call lazy sonnets. Sonnets that bring that idea of a sonnet, but don't necessarily adhere in any way to those rules. Now, Johnson's sonnet is a tighter sonnet. She is using some of those descriptions there, but she's filling it with images and language that we would not have necessarily expected to hear in a sonnet, right? Even that title, Sonnet to a Negro in Harlem, right? She's making it very clear that I am writing this in praise of a man that I've seen, that I would see on the street, and I'm celebrating all of the contradictory aspects of him and his body moving through the space that she ends telling us, that is too splendid for him to occupy. Usually when we see in a sonnet is it starts with an idea, and then that couplet, there's often a kind of turn there. Again, not always, but that is one of the ways in which the sonnet form has retained a real power and a staying power for Black poets. However, they are often using it in ways that are innovative or unconventional. This other poet I wanted to share some work from. He's definitely a Harlem Renaissance poet. For a couple of reasons, I wanted to talk about him. His name is Gene Toomer. He actually attended the University of Wisconsin. He was from Washington, D.C., which is where he grew up, and he came out here to study agriculture. He's one of the many, sometimes we talk about people who attended, didn't necessarily finish. He decided instead of pursuing agriculture, he would then return to the East Coast and pursue poetry. So you could dig a little deeper into Toomer's life to hear about there are other connections between him, especially the Spring Green area. And I'll just sort of leave that there. So Toomer's writing I wanted to share because it's very different from Johnson's. In this poem, which is titled Her Lips Are Copper Wire, which I will also read, you'll hear that unlike the language, the kind of controlled, balanced language in Johnson's work, the images here are much more, I would say that they're much more flowing. There's less of a story being told. Her lips are copper wire. Whisper of yellow globes gleaming on lampposts that sway, like boot-led liquor drinker in fog, and let your breath be moist against me, like bright beads on yellow globes. Telephone the powerhouse, that are the main wires are insulate. Her words play softly up and down, dewy corridors of billboards. Then with your tongue, remove the tape and press your lips to mine till they are incandescent. So you can see here he's dispensed with, there's not much punctuation here. The real focus here is on the image. And so instead of using something like the sonnet or really standard quatrains with those, repeating those 4 lines, the focus here, again, is on creating an image in your mind. And Toomer is much more engaged with the tradition of modernist writers, people like Eliot, T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound during that time. His subject matter, though, is still, writing about the places and the people that he knows. But we can see within the tradition of the Harlem Renaissance, those are just 2 very different writers during that time, that people were beginning to experiment with form and do lots of, and use form in ways and use the language in ways that were designed to defamiliarize and replacing, content or present unexpected content. And all of this, again, coming under this movement or this era of the Harlem Renaissance, which is often also called the New Negro Renaissance, the New Negro Movement, again, during that earlier part of the 20th century. The idea was that writers and artists could, through artistic activism, really change the social economic situation. And so there was some debate between scholars after the Harlem Renaissance, how effective was it, right? Did we see the kinds of change that we really wanted to see, or was it just the beginning? And so depending on how one teaches or one's perspective, you can look and see those innovations in poetry as real change, as real impact. You can look and say, well, what happened after the Depression? Can we make a connection between what poetry did and the situation, the economic, the political situation of Black people in the country, which, especially during the Depression on through the beginnings of what we would call the long civil rights movement, don't suggest that as much progress was made as we would think. But I think there's different ways to look at progress. And again, going back to the cycles or the momentums around artistic movements, and again, when poetry comes into play. So I spent a lot of time there, partly because the Harlem Renaissance, again, is my era of specialization, but really the other era that is often paired, if you were in my class and we were going through all of these histories really in depth, I would certainly share poetry from the Black arts movement, which comes right as the civil rights movement is ending and the Black power movement is beginning in the 60s and 70s. The Black arts or Black power movement, you had writers like Amiri Baraka, Sonia Sanchez, some of you may know Nikki Giovanni, Haki Madhubuti, many others who, again, turned to poetry and saw that as an art form that could be politically galvanizing and very much invented new forms during that period. I wanted to share, though, and so like I said, I'm jumping ahead. So I'm letting you know there was this Black arts movement that happened, right? And then jumping ahead a little bit to talk about poets from 2 distinct periods. So the first, this is Gwendolyn Brooks. She was one of our first poet laureates, very much a well-known poet, very much a master of the sonnet, though the poem I'm going to share with you from Brooks today is not a sonnet. It's probably her most famous poem, and she's going to talk a little bit about this in a video that I'm about to show you how she feels about this particular poem. It's called We Real Cool, and we can go ahead and show that video.
Thank you. I guess I'd better offer you We Real Cool. Most young people know me only by that poem. I don't mean that I dislike it, but I would prefer it if the textbook compilers and the anthologists would assume that I've written a few other poems. I wrote it because I was passing by a pool hall in my community one afternoon during school time, and I saw therein a little bunch of boys, I say here in this poem, 7, and they were shooting pool. But instead of asking myself, why aren't they in school? I asked myself, I wonder how they feel about themselves. And just perhaps they might have considered themselves contemptuous of the establishment, or at least they wanted to feel that they were contemptuous of the establishment, might want to thumb their noses at the establishment, and I represented the establishment with the month of June, which is a nice, gentle, non-controversial, enjoyable, pleasant, fragrant month that everybody loves. This poem has been banned here and there because of the word jazz, which some people have considered a sexual reference. That was not my intention, though I have no objection if it helps anybody. But I was thinking of music. The pool players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. We real cool, we left school, we learn late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we thin gin, we jazz June, we die soon. I'm going to read you 3 more poems. Okay.
I hope you enjoyed listening to Gwendolyn Brooks read that poem. She's really one of my favorite poets, and since we had her, we had a recording of her reading it, I thought it would be good to hear it in her own voice. One of the reasons why this is one of her most anthologized poems is that it's just powerful, simple. The language, though, is complex. There's assonance and consonants there where she's repeating vowel sounds and she's repeating the consonants, and you can hear the internal rhyme and rhythm of this poem. Part of what I wanted to show you, though, here is Brooks was also, again, a master of the sonnet. So she has many sonnets, many that are lazy, but also very traditional as well, that she's innovated on. But this is a poem that has had such a lasting impact that contemporary poet Terence Hayes actually used the poem to create a new form, a form that he calls the Golden Shovel. So here are the words from the poem you just heard, the second line there, 7 at the Golden Shuffle. And she told you a little bit about why she wrote that poem, or what the impetus was in the video. In Terence's poems, or in this form that he created called the Golden Shovel, which I will show a little bit of, let's see. Again, you're going to travel with me away for just a moment. What you'll see here is in this form, this poem, The Golden Shovel, which he has after Gwendolyn Brooks, what he has done is he's taken the last words or the lines from Brooks' poem. So you can see here, we real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight. So that's from Gwendolyn Brooks' poem, but he's added different words here, different language. So the stanza begins, when I am so small, dad's sock covers my arm. We cruise at twilight until we find the place, the real. So when Terence Hayes came up with this, this was something, something or experiment that he made, but that other poets, other Black poets within the tradition have taken up. So you can find lots of examples of golden shovels. So you can see there the synergy between the innovations that Brooks was doing with form there, with language, with what she was writing about, and then how later poets like Hayes, who's a well-known MacArthur winner, has continued to bring the tradition forward. I wanted to show a few images from a collective of Black poets that I'm actually a part of, called Cave Canem, which is Latin for beware of dog. And it is a collective fellowship of writers that's been around now for 25 years, founded by poets Cornelius Eady and Toy Dericote. And I wanted to share this because I wanted you, again, thinking back to that image of Amanda Gorman, to understand her as part of a community that uses poetry both for that community, but also to communicate the concerns, both the interior and the exterior desires of that community on a broader scale, but also the ways in which poets really listen to each other. So you can see that in some of the poems that I've shown moving through time, but that also gathering together is very important. So you'll see these are images. This is from the summer retreat of Cave Canem, the one here where I'm moving around over here with, and you have the founders, Toy Dericote and Cornelius Eady. And then in the other image, I just want to highlight, there I am towards the bottom, but there are also several poets just in this one image that have been in Wisconsin at different times as part of the fellowship program here for the Institute for Creative Writing. So we have Lauren Russell and Derek Austin, Natasha LeCun, and then in the middle here is another very well-known poet on the page and a spoken word artist, Patricia Smith. So definitely you would see some continuity here with her writing, and some of you might be familiar with others in these images as well. And one of the neat things about many of the people who are involved in Cave Canem, including myself, is many of us are both scholars, but also practitioners, right? So someone who also writes poetry. So in the last time that I wanted to spend today, I wanted to talk about my book, Grimoire. You might have heard me mention a little bit about this in the podcast. This is a book of poetry inspired by the first known cookbook by an African-American woman, a cookbook by Malinda Russell. And I actually have an image here from it there. You can see it's a domestic cookbook for the kitchen by Malinda Russell. And I wrote this book because I wanted to know more about Russell's life. She published this cookbook to support herself and her young son. She's a widow. She was a cook and had a pastry shop in Tennessee and had a life really in the mid 19th century that's hard for us to imagine a free woman of color having during that time. She traveled to Michigan during the Civil War, in the midst literally of the Civil War, but we don't know a lot about her, very much about her life beyond what is included in this cookbook. And so I thought, in the sense that poetry or recipes are preserving ancestral knowledge in a way that poetry also does, I thought that a book of poetry would be a really good way to both commemorate her, but also get at or uncover some of the aspects of her life that we don't know about, and to do that through the imagination. One of the earliest poems that I have in the book is this poem, Wild Yeast. And this is a poem when I do traditional poetry readings, I almost always read this poem. I'm not going to read it here because I'm actually going to read a poem that I don't normally read at the end, but I did want to include it because for those of you who might see the book, who have heard me read it elsewhere, I always say how several of the lines in this poem are drawn from the poet Paul Laurence Dunbar. And so you here have an image of Dunbar, and several of the lines that are mentioned here are from his poem. So there's a way in which I am drawing here on Malinda. I'm in the kitchen, I'm talking to my son here. The poem begins, what color is Shakespeare? To answer, I read my son Dunbar. Right, so Dunbar, you have his image here. And so really you could go line by line with this poem, and you could see the ways in which I'm trying to connect with Malinda's tradition of cooking in the kitchen, with the wordsmithing of poets like Paul Laurence Dunbar, and also using cooking, right, as a way to think about child rearing, especially child rearing at a time of crisis. Many of the poems in this book, the ones that are not historical, look at mothering, specifically the mothering of Black children. I have 2 boys, and so some of these poems, even as they meditate on the historical difficulties of what it's meant for Black women to mother under difficult circumstances, they also come into the present with my experience. I do have a little link here if you wanted to hear a fellow poet, has written an essay actually about this poem and published it in 32 poems. If you want to hear more about Wiley in particular, I thought that maybe I would send you there instead of sharing. So as I said, the poems in the beginning are very much historical, thinking about Malinda Russell's life, thinking about cooking and baking, and the ones in the latter section really deal more broadly with what it means to mother under a time of crisis. Bringing this back to COVID, it's interesting. I wrote this at a time, before the pandemic, and yet I ended up doing a lot of bringing back a lot of the baking that I did in terms of writing this book under COVID. So I was one of the many people who was out there looking for flour and yeast and trying to bake bread for my family. I was also very much engaged in educating my children who were doing virtual homeschooling. And so what's really interesting about this poem, this is a poem in the book called Cross Stars that I almost never read, but I thought I'd share it here because it brings up this idea of the sonnet, because it is definitely a lazy sonnet. So it's using the form, but in a very loose way. But it brings up really, the challenges of homeschooling, especially homeschooling children of color. Cross Stars. For our English unit, I decide on Shakespeare. We'll read, then write an English sonnet. We'll go see Romeo and Juliet at the American Players, taking advantage of the homeschool special. A row of single mothers and our single charges. The children will sit together, the mothers behind, or the children will sit alternately, a mother between. Or we will sit 2 and 2 in pairs, parent and partner, a matinee sun overhead. Discounted sheets throw no shade. We melt the amphitheater, neither hats nor parasols allowed, so mothers fan whichever child is on whatever side, and we can barely recall whatsoever if it was the moon or the nurse or the poison that betrayed the lovers. For those of you who live in Wisconsin and have been to the American Players Theater, you'll know that if you get a ticket in one of those plays that's at 12 o'clock, that it is incredibly hot, and you can't put up sunshades or anything. So that was part of what I was trying to think through, this experience of bringing children. And then, you're trying to concentrate on what the play is, what's going on, and trying to explain to them, oh, this is Shakespeare, and here's why you should pay attention, and here's what's going on. But everyone is sweating, and the children are maybe too young for this. And just that experience there, I wanted to communicate both the pleasures of doing homeschooling, but also certainly the challenges here. So I think I'll end there. Hopefully I've kind of brought you full circle, kind of thinking back to where we began with Amanda Gorman and seeing just what the, again, long history that I really just screenshot and just touched on of the African American poetic tradition, coming back to some of the work that I've done to excavate that and to build on that tradition in Grimoire. So yeah.
Yeah, Cherene, thank you so much. And
Mr.
thanks for giving us a
President,
glimpse into
Dr.
your
Biden,
art and your craft,
Madam
and using a
Vice
very relevant
President.
example that so many of us can relate to, during COVID and what we all experienced. It's interesting how each of these poems that you've shared is really just a personal essay from somebody. So it's such a wonderful glimpse just into the lives of these people and the times. So thanks for sharing that. Hi, everybody. Fran Paleo, Moyer Badger Talks producer, talking with Cherene Sherrard-Johnson today. Feel free to post any questions in the chat that you might have for Cherene. So we had an interview recently with Stephanie Elkins of Wisconsin Public Radio, and we learned about the life of composer Florence Price. I don't know if you're familiar with her or her music, but she's an African-American composer from what I believe to be the Harlem Renaissance. And as I do a quick Google search, Cherene, I see that the Harlem Renaissance, like you talked about, is comprised of not just poets, but musicians and artists. And can you give us just a very big, broad picture of what that looked like? And were there any collaborations between the different genre of artists during that time?
Certainly. Yeah. So I touched here on some of the poets from that era, but it was certainly a movement that involved dance, early Black film, certainly the music that, like that we would be familiar with, jazz, but also the blues. Um, there were lots of collaborations. I mean, Langston Hughes, who I mentioned earlier, is well known as a blues poet, right? So he used a lot of the structures from the blues stanza in his work. So yeah, my work is focused a lot on visual culture and the painters and the illustrators and how that work manifested in literature as well. So yeah, you had lots of what you might call inter-artistic collaborations. And just whether it was just from inspiration during the salons, because those salons, like the one I described, would have involved people who were, again, not just writers, but musicians, visual artists, dancers like Catherine Dunham, certainly composers like the one you referenced.
Yeah, and super cool that Madam C.J. Walker hosted, supported that type of activity. So Self-Made is the movie, because I did see it and I had to look at. And Octavia Spencer played Madam C.J. Walker, did just a fantastic job. That was really a great movie. If you haven't caught that, please do, everybody. Mm-hmm. So in listening to We Real Cool by Gwendolyn Brooks, you couldn't not hear the percussive tone in her voice, which I know you also kind of referenced. Is that a lead into hip hop?
That's a good question. So there are lots of connections. It's hard to say that specific Gwendolyn Brooks poem, but there certainly are connections between the art form that would develop that we know as hip hop and the tradition of playing the dozens, right? So that kind of braggadocio, using the vernacular, using rhymes, using rhyming couplets in particular. So certainly I haven't quite, I think thinking about it in relationship to Brooks, I wouldn't necessarily make that particular connection there. But now that you mention it, definitely I can hear, in terms of some of the rhythms of her voice. But yeah, hip hop certainly came out of, again, that long oral tradition, not just the sermons and the songs, but again, that back and forth of playing the dozens, the jokes that people would tell on street corners, and the sharing of knowledge that eventually, came to be performed and blended in with other ways of using the voice, whether it was the beatbox or the crosshatch and DJing and all of the other elements of hip hop. And obviously, I'm not hip hop is not an area that I study, but like the Harlem Renaissance, it does involve multiple genres. So again, visual art in terms of the graffiti, dance in terms of what was, during the time break dancing, right, as well. So there's, so it is also a multi-genre art form.
Yeah, her delivery was just amazing. I mean, you can read the words, but like hearing her deliver them was a whole different experience. I definitely will seek her out to try to find other recordings. Very interesting. We have a post from Erica Tronson, who just says, "Thank you so much, Professor Sherrard-Johnson. Your talk was just wonderful."
Oh, that's great to hear. Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit, you identified yourself as a scholar, writer, professor, and poet. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you became interested personally in this area?
Well, I was always interested in writing. I was a big reader as a young girl, and so the idea, I was the kind of child who was always writing her own books, right? Putting them together with staples and oh dear, hold on a second. You would think after all
the magic of live.
I know the Zoom. There's a phone hiding somewhere. I was like, "Where is that phone?" Yeah. So when I said as a young girl, I was always reading. Always had my head in a book. But early in my life, I wanted to be an actress, not necessarily a writer. So it's interesting that I made that pivot over time. And I think because there is this aspect of poetry that you are reciting, or even as a professor that you lecture. So I still feel like there's some of those elements of performance that I was attached to that I've maintained. So I would say that those were things, I always loved reading. I always loved writing. I definitely enjoy, I can be a bit of an introvert, but I'm also an extrovert. I have that combination that I think a lot of artists and writers have, where you definitely like your quiet time, but you also really want to share and connect. And I think that's part of why being a professor and a writer was the right thing for me. In terms of just sort of traditional, education, I was an English major in college at UCLA. I had an emphasis in African American studies. And then when I, was thinking about what I wanted to do for graduate school, I really loved Toni Morrison's writing. And so I went to graduate school thinking I would, write on Toni Morrison. And I have written about her, but it was really through graduate school that I discovered, again, that longer, earlier history and wanted to work on more earlier parts of the 20th century, like the Harlem Renaissance.
Great. Well, Cherene, thanks so much for joining us today and taking us on this really, really cool journey. I hope many others are inspired by your talk today as well as I have been. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Fran. It's great to be here with everyone. I hope everyone enjoyed the talk, and I just look forward to talking more.
Great. And thanks so much for doing the podcast. We do have a Badger Talks podcast, which you can find on all of the podcast channels, the Apple Podcast and Spotify. You can find it out there. And Cherene was our beta test podcaster. So thank you so much for doing that interview. You'll hear some of her personal stories in that podcast interview with Ben Rush. Also, please visit us at badgertalks.wisc.edu, our website, where you can see our upcoming schedule of talks. We're going to be posting the fall schedule out there shortly. Sign up for our email list. Consider a donation to Badger Talks. We are supported by a grant. You can also search the roster of over 400 speakers who've signed up to give talks virtually and in person around the state. Join us Tuesday, August 10th. So we're going to skip a week and then we're going to start again with a focus on the La Follette School of Public Affairs. And we're going to be talking with Christine Durance, who's going to be talking about issues in health policy and some of the big questions she's investigating in her research. So don't miss it. We'll look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks for tuning in.